without any further ado, I am going to introduce our first speaker. So we're joined now by Dr. Caralee McLeish. She heads New Zealand's Treasury as Secretary and Chief Executive, comes from a background leading Treasury functions in Australia, and earlier in her career had worked in Washington DC at the World Bank, also at the International Red Cross and at Boston Consulting Group. So a long distinguished career. We now hand over to you, Caralee, and we'll see if the technology works and you can beam in live.
Thank you very much, Matt. And tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today, and to our host at the University of Waikato for bringing us together. It's a great occasion. I will just move to sharing my screen presentation. Now, can you see that?
Yes, we'll.
Very good. So this morning, I would like to make a few observations on the economy, which has been resilient, in part thanks to the strong economic and health response to COVID. But we are seeing some shorter-term issues around capacity and inflation, as well as longer-term issues, including a higher debt position. So, how do we address these? What are the trade-offs we face and the three goals of fiscal policy? Improving living standards, macroeconomic stability, and fiscal sustainability. So with those questions in mind, what I'd like to do is outline some of the three big choices that New Zealand faces around fiscal policy. So let's start with the economy and how the Treasury is seeing that. We're now in year 3 of the pandemic. COVID-19 has caused severe disruption in some sectors and for some businesses and people. But overall, the economy has proven resilient to date. We've seen unprecedented volatility in quarterly GDP, as you can see here, but overall, the level of economic activity is now starting to approach the pre-COVID trend, and it's also stronger than in many other advanced economies. Government spending, monetary policy have played central roles in this resilience. Among the really remarkable aspects of the COVID-19 downturn is the nature of the supply shocks. Lockdowns shut both production and consumption in many industries, and subsequent catch-up production has not been possible in the same way as catch-up demand. In addition, the availability of workers has been impacted by border restrictions. Global supply chains have been severely disrupted, which is constraining businesses' ability to meet demand. But the resilience of the economy and the tightness of supply are especially evident in labour markets. So we've seen unemployment underutilisation at below pre-pandemic levels across all ethnicities, as well as for women and youth, although existing disparities do remain. Importantly, participation in the labour force has held up, unlike some other advanced countries. Border restrictions have contributed to the tight labour market, as industries experiencing skill shortages have been less able to access international workers. But in some cases, border restrictions have cushioned the blow to the labour market. For example, while retail and accommodation experienced some of the highest falls in employment in the 2 years to last December, this was offset by the falls in working holiday visa holders, who comprise about a quarter of the jobs in accommodation and food services. So resilient demand combined with interrupted supply has brought inflationary pressures. Inflation has risen overseas for similar reasons, and global inflation is also impacting New Zealand, with fuel prices being the greatest driver of inflation, as you can see here. At the onset of COVID-19, central banks in New Zealand and overseas reduced interest rates. This supported consumption and employment, and it also boosted asset prices, exacerbating wealth inequalities between those with and without assets. With inflation on the rise, central banks in New Zealand and overseas have either started lifting interest rates or signalled that they will, and this will have a dampening effect on asset prices. In New Zealand, we've already seen the housing market start to slow, which we forecast to continue. We're expecting inflation to peak in March 22 and ease over the coming years as conditions normalise. While the economy overall has been surprisingly resilient, COVID-19 has driven some real shifts in the economy's structure, some of which have fuelled inflation as relative prices change. You can see here a breakdown of economic growth that shows government consumption playing a really strong role in supporting demand. Residential investment and, to a lesser extent, private consumption have also grown strongly, supported by rising house prices. Imports, exports of services have fallen dramatically, of course, alongside the lack of international travel. And so businesses that are reliant on overseas tourists or students are really struggling. New Zealanders have also substituted away from services into consuming durable goods. People are buying new cars and kitchens instead of taking their overseas holidays. And that same switch from services to goods is happening globally, which is boosting commodity prices. Our key exporters are experiencing high prices for their products, and in terms of trade are at their highest in more than 100 years. Consumer spending, we also see shifts there from in-person to online, and the increase in working from home has changed consumption patterns within cities. But despite all this disruption and all these really significant shifts, we don't see evidence of widespread scarring to date. And some of the longer term trends that New Zealand has faced have persisted, such as growing terms of trade and low productivity growth. Today we're facing into rising cases of the Omicron variant. It's disrupting both demand and supply through worker absences and individual efforts to avoid illness rather than via lockdowns. Our analysis at Treasury suggests that Omicron will reduce March quarter GDP by about 1.5 to 2 percentage points. However, international experience suggests that Omicron waves peak quickly and that economic activity rebounds relatively rapidly. So, pandemic has shown us time and again how quickly the outlook can change. Main uncertainty continues to be COVID-19, but New Zealand remains in a strong position to withstand some of the risks and challenges ahead, with among the most robust economic performance in advanced countries through the pandemic, but also low levels of government debt relative to peers. So that takes me to my next part of this presentation, fiscal policy. So fiscal policy has played a central role in the resilience of the economy through the pandemic to date. Wage subsidy, other economic supports have helped keep people in jobs and businesses running. Funding enabled an effective health response, and increases to benefits and other welfare spend have supported vulnerable people. New Zealand had one of the largest and also the most timely fiscal responses among advanced economies. This was made easier by Crown balance sheet, strong Crown balance sheet entering into the pandemic, which was supported by a firm commitment across successive governments over many years to fiscal sustainability. Debt has risen dramatically, although the increase is close to the OECD average and far less than originally predicted, as you can see here, thanks largely to the resilience of the economy. Back at the start of the pandemic, Treasury's view was that the choices for fiscal policy were relatively clear. Given the extreme nature of the shock, a swift and strong fiscal response was required. The risks of providing too little support when it was needed far outweighed providing too much support if not needed. But looking ahead, the choices for fiscal policy entail a more considered balance across the three key goals of fiscal policy: improving living standards, macroeconomic stability, and fiscal sustainability. So as mentioned at the start, I wanted to highlight three areas where governments face choices in setting fiscal policy that we believe are particularly relevant for the period ahead, and noting also that they're not exhaustive, of course. So these are the weight that's placed on macroeconomic stability versus other living standards, objectives, prudent debt versus prudent investment, and fiscal versus other government policies. I'll outline briefly the ways in which Treasury aims to surface the trade-offs that are inherent in these choices in our advice to ministers, who are, of course, ultimately responsible for weighing the options and making decisions. So first, weight placed on macroeconomic stability objectives. So that the main focus of fiscal policy is raising revenue, allocating spending in a way that lifts living standards. Fiscal policy enables short-term, long-term investments in schools, hospitals, roads, social environmental services, and essential infrastructure, for example. Macroeconomic conditions such as inflation, state of the labour market, exchange rates, they also matter in setting fiscal policy, but they're only one factor and need to be balanced against other objectives. Governments have choices about balancing macroeconomic conditions now with shaping long-term well-being later. Main policy tool for managing economic cycles is monetary policy. Fiscal policy has an important supporting role, though, particularly through automatic stabilisers that help to make economic cycles less pronounced. And as we've seen through the pandemic, fiscal policy can also be really effective in supporting living standards by holding up activity in the face of significant shocks and by targeting those who are most affected. But that said, an excessive short-term stabilisation focus for discretionary fiscal policy could lead to frequent changes in spending and tax program, which in turn could impose macroeconomic costs. Moreover, given various lags that are inherent in discretionary fiscal policy outside emergency spending, there's also a real risk that attempts at stabilisation actually end up exacerbating the economic cycle. Fiscal policy can, of course, contribute to inflation for any given level of activity. Fiscal stimulus will add to demand, and that puts pressure on prices. A few important points of clarification, though. First, demand is boosted by fiscal stimulus, not just spending. We need to look at revenue also. Second, the extent of any effect on stimulus on inflation will depend on the nature and the timing of spending. And finally, we need to look also at the supply side of the economy. If an increase in demand were accompanied by an increase in supply, we would expect growth, not inflation. So what does this mean for fiscal policy today when inflation is high? While the extent of fiscal stimulus has been very large, the Treasury's last forecast show fiscal tightening from June this year, with a return to surplus by 2024 and a negative fiscal impulse from next year onwards. So that reflects the wind down of economic supports that were temporary by design, and also solid revenue growth, offset by significant allowances to achieve government's budget objectives, which include tackling climate change and health reform. Economic supports are still available through the pandemic, but they're more targeted now and aimed at avoiding scarring rather than the broader support for demand that was provided earlier. Net effect is that fiscal policy is dampening pressure on inflation in the coming years. While the Treasury is forecasting inflation to remain above the RBNZ target range through 2022 for the next couple of years, fiscal policy is not the main factor driving this. Now, of course, there are options about the speed, the extent of fiscal tightening. Interactions with monetary policy are relevant to these choices. Any government spending is expected to add to demand relative to not spending and will require greater monetary policy response than otherwise. Fiscal multipliers are also higher when rates are low. But with interest rates close to the effective lower bound, fiscal policy may support monetary policy in normalising and enable further headroom for future downturns. Ultimately, the balance of these macroeconomic and microeconomic objectives are choices for the government of the day, and our role at the Treasury is to help inform these decisions by making clear those trade-offs. Now, the second choice that I wanted to speak about was between prudent debt and prudent investment. So the concept of prudent debt was introduced in New Zealand's legislation through the Fiscal Responsibility Act back in 1994, part of a series of public finance reforms that are internationally renowned for promoting fiscal discipline and performance. The authors didn't define prudent, and instead they gave governments the flexibility to interpret the principles of responsible fiscal management in the economic context of the time. So there's really no magic number for optimal debt. As Treasury advised back in 1994, it varies with the circumstances. Our view at the Treasury today is that today's level and trajectory of debt is prudent and consistent with the principles of responsible fiscal management. Fiscal framework is enduring, but the context has changed. We examine three main factors in determining prudent debt, so debt sustainability, market access, and the welfare or well-being effects of debt. And just looking at context, net core crown debt reached its peak of 55% of GDP in 1992. That was shortly before the FRA, Fiscal Responsibility Act, was passed, and at that time a long-term objective of net debt at 20 to 30% of GDP was established, as you can see here. You can also see here just how different the context was at that time, with the Crown facing negative net worth, low ratings, credit ratings, and much higher interest rates. And by contrast, as the Treasury advises now on post-pandemic debt targets, debt servicing sustainability and market access considerations are completely different. The decline that you can see here in debt costs reflects a longer-term trend of falling neutral interest rates. The result is that interest rates are lower than growth rates, which is a condition of considerable importance to fiscal policy. It reduces the welfare cost of debt, and it creates more fiscal headroom. Now, we can't be certain that these favourable debt dynamics will continue indefinitely in the near term. Of course, rates are expected to rise as monetary policy normalises, but falling neutral interest rates is a global trend. It reflects strong savings with investment driven by long-term factors. And while not unanimous, the general consensus is that these long-term forces are unlikely to reverse and neutral interest rates will remain low. So an important point that I'd like to stress is that prudent debt is also inextricably linked with the concept of prudent investment, which captures the welfare or well-being effects of spending. While lower debt targets can enhance short-term fiscal sustainability, set too low, they risk inefficient cuts in public investment or increases in taxation that can reduce overall well-being. And conversely, debt limits that are set too high can impose costs on future generations or lead to wasteful spend. There is some evidence that investment has been below prudent levels. Te Wāhanga, the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, have estimated a historical infrastructure gap of $104 billion. For many years, New Zealand's capital intensity has been below the OECD average and one of the drivers of poor productivity performance. Higher rates of both private and public investment are likely to be critical to achieving objectives around New Zealand's long-standing challenges, such as housing, climate change and productivity. The two are closely related. There's international evidence that additional public investment can catalyse private investment, and increased certainty about the path of public investment can also allow industries like construction to plan and prepare for higher levels of activity. But striking the right balance between prudent debt and investment depends critically on the rigour and the enforcement of public investment disciplines. The more credible the investment framework, the better the ability to identify value for money proposals, and then the less there is a need for blunt and restrictive debt targets. Without these disciplines, there is a risk that looser debt targets could lead to wasteful spend. So choices on prudent debt and prudent investment also require close attention to rules on operating spending. The Treasury's long-term fiscal statement shows that if historical trends continue, the greatest risks to debt sustainability are from rising superannuation costs and health expenditure, as you can see here. Ensuring that operating expenses are covered by operating revenue helps to ensure intergenerational equity. It means that the current generation pays for its own consumption and debt can be used for investments that provide returns to future generations. Treasury is currently examining how fiscal indicators can set the right incentives for both prudent debt and investment. For example, in measures of net debt, the treatment of monetary policy, financial assets and crown entities can affect the incentives on the direction of fiscal policy and also how resources are allocated. And what's clear is that there's no one perfect fiscal target. Any targets need to be considered along a comprehensive suite of fiscal performance measures that are embedded in a broader and rigorous fiscal framework. And that takes me to the third trade-off, which is the weight placed on fiscal versus other policies. So government has a wide set of tools available. Fiscal, regulatory, social policies, and careful consideration is needed on which tools to use when. I touched briefly on some of the interactions of monetary and fiscal policy earlier, but more broadly, in setting fiscal policy, we always need to check whether alternatives can achieve the policy objective more effectively. In many instances, and particularly where affordability and macroeconomic concerns are high, non-fiscal levers can provide more attractive options for achieving government's objectives. But I think New Zealand's climate policy response provides an example of assessing how fiscal and other policy tools can be leveraged alongside one another. Global climate change represents what's been termed as the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. Those who emit greenhouse gases have not paid for the full cost of the emissions. And correcting this through price signals on emissions is our first best solution and one that we stand strongly behind at the Treasury. But there are reasons why emissions pricing cannot be the only tool in our climate policy toolbox. While emissions pricing corrects for one key failure, there are more to be addressed, such as imperfect information, asymmetric information, incomplete markets, consumer behaviour. And in addition, at present, the emissions trading scheme, our core emissions pricing instrument in New Zealand, doesn't cover all sectors and all businesses in the economy. So given this, price mechanisms are necessary, but not enough. Complementary, regulatory, other non-spending measures alongside value for money spending measures are needed to achieve our emissions goals at minimum cost. Moreover, complementary measures may be used to support equity in the climate transition or achieve other social goals. Ultimately, a choice of how to use these levers comes down to assessing a number of trade-offs and requires consideration of efficiency, equity, broader distributional concerns from economic perspectives, but also social, cultural and environmental perspectives. And the Treasury's Living Standards Framework helps us to assess some of those trade-offs. So in closing then, while the economy has proven resilient to date, COVID response policies have involved some pretty tough trade-offs. As we continue to navigate the pandemic and look ahead to recovery, choices and trade-offs for fiscal policy will persist. They require a considered balance across the goals of improving living standards, macroeconomic stability and fiscal sustainability. There are no simple answers here. We need to weigh costs and benefits. We don't know yet what the next shock will be, but we must evaluate the lessons from the pandemic response to help us navigate what will be inevitable shocks and changes ahead. We also seek to understand the effects of economic policy, not just on the fiscal and traditional economic measures, as I've mainly focused on today, but also broader measures of living standards. And later this year, the Treasury is going to release its first wellbeing report, which is a new stewardship requirement under the Public Finance Act that asks us to examine the state, the trends and the underlying drivers of wellbeing in New Zealand. And we look forward to engaging with academics, others in the economic profession, hopefully members of the audience here on this important work. So thank you. I will close there and kia ora. Look forward to questions.
Kia ora, Caralee. Thank you. And some fascinating looks back, particularly of the contrast between now and the mid-90s, where we went through so many policy changes. Can I start, I guess, with the reflection? There are a lot of challenges coming at us, and there are also a lot of reforms in play. For those sitting outside of the mechanics of government, what is the role of Treasury in doing the cost-benefit analysis and weighing the trade-offs? You've really dwelt on those trade-offs. And how is that happening now with simply so many different things in play versus analysis happening on reforms within one industry? How's Treasury's role in that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And there certainly is a very large reform agenda, as well as the response to the COVID pandemic. And Treasury as a central agency is really involved in almost every aspect of that in some way. But I think importantly, it's a responsibility of agencies who are preparing policy proposals to really develop the analysis on those choices, the trade-offs, the costs and the benefits. Treasury has a supporting role and we prepare guidelines and frameworks and we'll work with agencies to conduct those sorts of assessments. But really the responsibility lies where the expertise also lies as well. Treasury, through the budget process, will have a really critical role in providing our assessment on policy proposals, not doing bottom-up cost-benefit analysis ourselves, but reviewing what the proposals are and analysis that's been done. And we provide that second opinion advice to government. And we also have a role through providing that second opinion advice through the cabinet process for regulatory proposals or other funding proposals. We are increasingly using our living standards framework to help assess proposals that come through so that we can identify some of the trade-offs that I spoke about today. And we also work with agencies to encourage use of the living standards framework as well as more traditional ways to assess policy choices and trade-offs.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to a question that's come through from the audience. So the comment was that Treasury had previously advised that the Reserve Bank should consider broadening the Monetary Policy Committee to allow academic experts or others to serve. Is that a current view of Treasury, or have you got a view on that now?
I'm sorry, on the appointments of the Monetary Policy Committee of the
committee, yeah. On
the membership of the bank. So, we haven't given advice on this recently, but we haven't changed our view, and I'm aware that there are appointment processes that are underway. So wouldn't want to comment on that.
Okay.
But no, we haven't.
No, that's fine, and that's one through from the audience. Can I then ask another one? Looking ahead, particularly, you've got the Living Standards Framework, you've touched on many things, including climate change and other issues. Where do you see the best investments being from a government point of view that are going to meet needs around commercial, growth of the economy, but also the social and environmental needs? What are the items that you see are the greatest opportunity for greater investment over the next 5 years?
That's a great question and a very broad one. There are many. I mean, I think one of the biggest transitions, well, without doubt, one of the biggest transitions ahead of the country is climate change. And so investments that support climate resilient economy and low emissions economy will be absolutely critical. I think there are big opportunities as well as the costs of transition. New Zealand already has great advantages in its high use of renewable energy and a lot of really sustainable agricultural practices. And so that shift to climate-friendly investments is one that I do see as a big opportunity, but it's also an imperative, and that will be driving a lot of allocation of resources in the economy overall. I think there are also opportunities in rebuilding and deepening our international connections. We know that that's a really critical element of driving productivity in New Zealand, and as border restrictions ease, there will be many opportunities that come from strengthening those channels with the export markets, and also the exchange of people and technologies and ideas that can support productivity. And I guess the final one that I'd highlight is just the infrastructure investment. Government has significantly increased funding for infrastructure, and I mentioned in my remarks the measures of the infrastructure gap. Now, infrastructure with the right projects can also really drive productivity. There's a lot of work that's underway in coordinating infrastructure programs, and the Infrastructure Commission, of course, is building up its national infrastructure strategy to really help focus investments on where they can best lift productivity and living standards for New Zealanders.
Thank you, Caralee. Another question that's come through from the audience, and it was specifically about whether and how Treasury is thinking about the potential of flow-on shocks from what's happening in Europe at the moment, tensions around Russia and Ukraine. And I might broaden that out to say, given the pandemic shock that we've been through over the last couple of years, there are obviously other things that could be happening geopolitically. Given the data you've shared with us today around debt and resilience, what's your take on our preparedness for other shocks or a potential sequence of shocks over the next few years? How do we think about that, or how does Treasury think about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's a great one. This is one of the things that we're reflecting on as we consider how to evaluate some of the lessons from the pandemic. Is resilience. How do we make sure that we really capture some of what we've learned and ensure that we're ready for the next shock, which we know will happen. And so we've learned a lot about economic supports and how to deliver those within the Treasury, but also the interactions of various different policies in the pandemic with health and economic policy, fiscal monetary policy, many more regulatory policies are important, but really trying to understand those interactions will put us in a better stead for whatever shocks come next. On Ukraine, look, this is something that a Treasury economics team are monitoring. It's an issue that Treasury economics team are monitoring closely. The tensions present a risk to the global economic outlook. We've seen some volatility in global markets. There's some risks around oil and fuel prices, and we've already seen some of that take effect, and present more potential disruptions to supply chains, which again may have impacts for inflation, for the inflation outlook. So it's an issue that we're monitoring closely. New Zealand isn't heavily exposed at this point, but no, it's something that we'll continue to keep close tabs on.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another one from the audience. You shared some data there around changes in trade and drop-offs and exports and imports and so on, certainly migration of people. There was a question that came through about, given the impacts of COVID, should the government be considering, or should New Zealand be considering, more national production in case of rolling pandemics, rolling disruptions in the supply chain over time?
Yeah, and I think that comes to the previous question about economic resilience. This is an element that we and countries around the world are considering. We saw, particularly at the early stages of the pandemic, just some really severe disruptions that exposed, I guess, the risks that are inherent in some of those international connections. So diversification of supply chains and diversification of markets is something to explore. It is one of the reflections on from the pandemic. So we're feeding that into some of our work on longer term resilience. There are always trade-offs. When there are sort of short-term gains to be made from focusing in on certain markets or certain suppliers, that makes it challenging. But we have learned that too much reliance can increase risk.
Right, thank you. And another one, a perennial topic, you touched on the revenue side of the equation. What thinking's being done about tax at the moment? Tax as an incentive, tax as a driver of productivity, potentially, and also as a source of revenue to manage debt, of course. What's been happening within the halls of Treasury recently in the discussions about tax?
Yeah, so tax, of course, that's always an issue that Treasury is thinking about and doing some work on. Most significant work recently was through the tax working group a couple of years ago, and the proposals and responses by Treasury at the time really outline our thinking on that. You can also see our thinking in some of our work in the long-term fiscal statement, which we released last year, and explored tax options to address some of the long-term fiscal sustainability challenges that we face. Back to my theme, it is about trade-offs. The benefits of higher taxes for fiscal sustainability as opposed to some of the welfare costs that can be imposed. And it really is one of the key areas where policy comes down to choices for government, weighing up those different factors. But our work is really trying to outline the analysis on what the costs and benefits are of those choices. And as I said, the most significant work we've done recently on that is summarised in our long-term fiscal statement.